The first thing is, I want to take a document here. If you go to the kernel topic here in this Linux book, you may find the architecture of this thing and that thing and all that. That and all, it's not a important thing. Okay, you can ignore that. But if you go down in this topic, understanding kernel, okay, so you see, we try to, kernel becomes a very important component in the container world. Okay, I'll tell how. That is why kernel is a very important thing. Now, please listen carefully. There are only two important points to discuss, in my opinion. So, you see, let's say this is your Linux machine. Okay, let's say a Linux machine. This one. This is a Linux machine. Linux machine. Okay. In the later on part, in the when we go to Docker, when we go to Kubernetes kind of subjects, we generally have a Linux machine, whether a Linux VM or Linux host machine, whatever it is. In this host machine, you may see, let's say, this the Linux machine means inside the machine you have a piece called kernel, okay, sitting within that. Okay, so this is the kernel. K K E R N E L. Okay, kernel, Linux kernel. So what happens is when you go and run containers, specifically, let's say for example, you install the Docker engine. Now I'm talking about Linux in terms of DevOps world. Okay, what it means to that. For example, let's say you have a container engine like Docker installed in your system. Okay, so now we are not into Docker and all the stories. Okay, but I'm just saying, let's say you have Docker installed, or in our session we see container D also, which is another thing project from Docker. We see other things like there are different container engines available. Okay, so basically Docker is not the only container engine, which it may be familiar one, but it is not the only container engine. Okay, so when you look into Linux world particularly, there are different container engines available. Okay, for example, let's say this is called Docker. Okay, which is a container engine, and you have another famous one. May not have heard it, which is called as Rocket, which is a byproduct of CoreOS. And you may have seen a byproduct of Docker company itself, which is called as Container D. Container D. I think containerd.io. We will use all these things. Okay. And we also have, sorry, have another one which is called as from the Kubernetes community, that is CRIO. Okay, CRIO. So these are all the famous container engines. Okay, CRIO. Okay, CRI-O. CRI-O. So if you want me to classify what these things, the Docker, the Rocket, the container DIO, CRIO, these are all can be classified under this category called container engines. Okay, container. In the low level, we may talk it like Docker. I mean, we may say it like container runtime software, something like that. But that's all container story. We'll talk about in Docker. I'm not getting into that level. Okay, so container engines. So when you see all these container engines, suppose when you are building it in a Linux machine, the Linux kernel has lots of important features. Okay, important features which enables this container engines to create containers. Okay, suppose these container engines, let's say for example, all are mostly powered with something called as a Linux kernel. Okay, without the Linux kernel, the container engines cannot function properly. Okay, so the main important thing or main important ingredient or a component required for a, um, a container engine to function is the kernel. You may ask why. There was a question generally when I say this. Why is it important? Okay, now I'm not into container part and all, so you have to understand it. You can't ask more questions about it because when I am into that, I will be fully into that. Okay, so now I'm in Linux part, so I'm just trying to make people understand why actually the Linux kernel is a very important one. Okay, so listen carefully. So, in order to make this container engines work properly, you need this Linux kernel to be available. Okay, because because most of the container engine softwares that you see in the market today are powered by Linux kernel. Okay, you can ask me why it is like that. I write the reason. Because the reason is because Linux kernel is an open source kernel. Okay, this is an open source kernel. Okay, this is an open source kernel. These are all, let's say, when you say container engine, what is container engine? Docker, Rocket, all open source projects. Open source projects. Okay, open source, all open source. So, a open source kernel powering the open source container engines. That is why container technology cannot be a better technology without the features of Linux kernel. Okay, whatever container engine that you do, Docker, Rocket, container, whatever you use, Linux kernel is the most ultimately important core which supplies all the features for the container engines. Okay. Now you can ask another question. So how this kernel is going to be used in that? Okay. And I would say that when you run containers, let's say for example, this is a machine where you run containers like let's say for example this is a um, in a Linux machine you can run a Windows container. Okay, Windows container, and this is a Ubuntu Linux container. Okay, and let's say this is a CentOS Linux container. So we can run we can run all these containers. Okay, which which has a shared kernel. Okay, which shares the kernel. Okay, so containers, when we go to container technology, we will learn why container doesn't have a kernel, why container consumes the host machine kernel. So many questions I will be answering in that level, but I'm just trying to focus on one point: why the Linux kernel today is the modern day Linux kernel is very important for the DevOps world, which means the whole container technology platform relies only based on the Linux kernel machines. Okay, so the kernel is very important, and people ask a question where how can this be, for example, sorry, sometimes the line does not come properly. No, okay, so fine. So there can be a question like, So what is it so special in this Linux kernel? Why it is so important for this technology? In the Linux kernel, there are modules. Okay, so in the matter of time, I will be opening few things up in maybe in another half an hour. Okay, in the Linux kernel, there are certain modules. Okay, or you can call it like features of the Linux kernels. Okay, modules like, I mean, there are built-in modules, so I don't believe you can see it in the modules list. Okay, or I can put it like the features. Okay, there are features like for example, the feature like namespaces, the feature like control groups, and there are features like so many other things, isolation capability, so many things are there, etc., etc., etc. Okay, so when you have more features of all these things, these features are the very important things for running and building a containerized infrastructure in a Linux machine or in a machine. In order to build a containerized infrastructure, okay, you need the Linux kernel, and then you need a container engine. Okay, using that, the container engines provision the containers like this. Okay, you see, whether this is a Ubuntu Linux machine, host machine, or whatever machine, you can run a Windows container, you can run a CentOS container, you can run a Ubuntu container, you can run CoreOS container, whatever container you want. So this is why the whole, when it comes to Kubernetes, Docker, Rocket, or Containerd, or anything will go, kernel becomes more important thing. That's why if you ask me, I think in the book there was one small point which I have referred, major container engines. Okay, if you want me to show it in a slight stunt, okay, so I'm not, you can't do it, please, you can't do it, but please listen. As I said, the containers doesn't have a, a kernel inside, and it is shared kernel which powers all the containers. I will just try to show a very few example from my host machine. Okay, right now we are not into Docker, but you guys have to understand. Please listen carefully. I will just try to show. It's just for observation. Okay, you can't try it now. Please watch it properly. This is all the list of container images we have, and in that I'm going to say I'm going to run a container. Okay, okay. Please see what I'm trying to prove. Okay, so I have now entered into the container shell. Okay, like how we are into the VM shell, I am into the container shell. Okay, I have used one of my SloopStash's base image to run a container, and now the container is running. Okay, so you see, there is a directory called boot directory. Okay, please listen carefully. The point is very important. In the book, I have noted the point, so which gives you the importance of what I'm talking about. So you see, if you go to the boot directory, so this is the boot directory of an Amazon Linux container. It's not a CentOS or Ubuntu or anything. Whatever you use, it's the same story. The boot directory of the Amazon Linux container is empty. Okay. In the first day of the session, I may have showed you the root directory of the Ubuntu host machine which I am having. So sorry, boot directory. You see the kernel listing. So this is the topic we are going to discuss in this next 2 hours. What's the important of it? You see something, but here you see it is totally empty. That is how the containers share the host machine kernel. So that's why Linux kernel is a very important kernel, and it powers you in a single Linux machine or a single bare metal Linux host or something. It can power a Windows container, it can power up a Linux Ubuntu container, or whatever operating system you want in containers, you can run it. second. So sometimes this highlighter doesn't work properly. Okay. So CentOS Linux container, Windows container, whatever it is. This is how kernel is very important um, technology that power. I mean component which powers the entire container engine or ecosystems. Okay. So I believe you may have understood the point. What point I was trying to prove is you can see containers does not come with its own kernel because containers depend on host kernel, and that's why powering up 1,000 containers in a single Linux machine also you need one single kernel in the machine, because I have ran that in many scales, so I know that one single Linux kernel that is available in the host machine this is my host machine. This is the kernel which powers this container here. Okay, that's the important thing. So this is the importance of the Linux kernel in modern day DevOps world.